There are moments in life that quietly or suddenly change everything. A diagnosis, a loss, a decision you didn't expect to make. And once that moment happens, the real question becomes, then what? Welcome to Change Happened, Then What? A storytelling podcast about the moments that shape us and the lives we build after them. Each episode brings you a real story told with honesty and care, where everything was questioned and where even then they chose to keep moving forward. This isn't an interview show. It's a place for real stories shared thoughtfully, sometimes messy, sometimes hopeful, but always human. I'm your host, Heather Holt, and I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin, I want to invite you into something I'm doing called the Changed Me Community Drawing. Stay tuned to the end of the episode to find out how you can enter into our monthly drawing for a super cozy Change Happened trucker hat or a super soft tee. Now, let's dive in. Before we begin today's episode, I just want to share that it includes conversations around suicide, addiction, and loss. If those topics feel heavy for you right now, please take care while listening. Pause when you need to, or come back to it another time. When I first received a message from John Dedakis asking to be a guest on the show, I did my research, and I knew he would be a perfect fit. But when I got on the interview with him, the story I thought I was going to tell wasn't the one that unfolded here. Because after talking to John, I realized something shifted in my understanding. When you're a journalist, you're taught to follow the facts, to ask the right questions, to tell the story clearly, even when it's hard. And over time, you learn how to stand close to tragedy without being pulled under by it. John Dedakis spent years doing exactly that. But this story, this one, is different. It's raw, it's real, and somehow, even in the middle of it, there is a thread of hope that never fully disappears. The kind that doesn't erase what happened, but reminds you that you can still find your way through it. Because what happens when the story isn't happening somewhere else, but when the story is yours?
My sister was 8 years older than I. I was born in 1942, right after Pearl Harbor, and my dad went into the service right after that. And after the war, they wanted to have another kid, but it wasn't possible. My mom had a miscarriage, and so it took a while for me to come along. There were times when my mom would say, "You're the little boy we prayed for." Or sometimes it was, "You're the little boy we prayed for." And so there was an 8-year difference between us, and we were rivals, I think, to a certain extent. This was at a time when television, began to, come into everyone's living room, and so the TV was right next to her piano. She could have been a concert pianist, so she was playing the piano all the time, and I was trying to listen to TV. I was not her favorite person, I would say. But as things went on and, you grow up and you have a little more maturity and self-awareness and realize you're not the center of the universe, I think we fell into a much better rapport. She had already gotten married. She was having a lot of personal issues. Depression was a problem for her. She attempted suicide several times. And by the time I got out of the Army, she had stabilized. and had found sort of a Christian faith. And I had too. There was a sort of a certain spiritual camaraderie that we had. But I remember hearing a sermon that seemed to be speaking to me, and it really got me energized about getting involved. And I called my mom and I said, Mom, I'm going to join the choir and teach Sunday school. I'm going to do all these things. And there was this silence, and she said, well, your sister could use some emotional support at her church. So I'd been to my sister's church. It was deader than a doornail as far as I was concerned, but I decided to do that instead. And so Georgia and I were at the same church at the same time. And so I would say near the end, we were probably, very close. We were able to talk about a lot of different things. And then I noticed that things seemed to be unraveling. It was hard for me to tell, but she just seemed more agitated, but at the same time resisted any attempt on my part to try to bridge the gap, to try to understand better. And I can remember a couple of months before she died, she was just in tears, but she couldn't express herself. And then the last time I saw her was after church. We were talking, and it was like there was this veil between us. And I could just tell she was almost catatonic, and yet I couldn't break through.
It's not all that unusual for siblings that far apart in age to not be especially close growing up. My brother and I were 7 years apart, me being the little sister, and I remember just wanting to be a part of his world, even though when you're younger, your worlds are so different. But like John and his sister, we grew closer as we got older, always connected, even across the miles. And what you're about to hear is John sharing in his own words, in that steady, journalistic way, the story of how he lost his sister. It's an important part of his story, but it's also a hard one. So if at any point it feels like too much to take in, I want to give you full permission to pause or skip ahead and take care of yourself while you listen.
I kept calling the house, but the line was busy. And when I finally got through, it was a voice that I thought was my brother-in-law. And I asked, if Georgia was there. Then I could tell that it was actually my nephew, and it sounded like he was laughing. And I didn't understand that. And then it became obvious that he was crying. And so I said, what's going on? And he was almost incoherent. All I heard was, she's gone. The door came down, the garage door was down. And I'm thinking, the garage door came and hit her on the head. I don't understand. So I said, I'll be right there. Before we turned the corner to her street, I said to Cindy, brace yourself. And I was really talking to myself. There wasn't an ambulance, no flashing lights, just a cop car. And I get out of the car and I go up to him and I say, I'm her brother. Tell me what happened. He said, she's deceased. But I said, I have to go see her. Amazingly, the cop took me across the street. She was lying on her back. She had been sitting on the stoop between the house, the entrance into the garage, and a phone was in her hand that, this was before cell phones. But it had a long cord that stretched from the kitchen wall. Eyes open. The fire department was there trying to get the carbon monoxide out of the house. It was mid-October. It was cold. And I remember picking up her hand, and it was cold. And I tried to warm it up. And it wouldn't get warm. And they let me be with her for a while. And then I had to call my folks and tell them. And that was the most difficult phone call I ever made in my life. And I made the phone call. I made the phone call on the phone with my sister dead at my feet. Whenever I would call my parents, it was usually my mom was on one extension and my dad was on another. And I said, and they were just having breakfast, so they were together in the kitchen. And I said, I need to talk to you both. Can Dad get on the extension? And she said, okay. And he went up to his office. And as he was on his way, she said,
it's about Georgia, isn't it?
She knew. And I said, I'll have to wait, let's wait till Dad gets on the line. And so he gets on the line. And I'm a kind of person who doesn't like euphemisms. I was a reporter. You give it to them straight. In journalism, you don't say they passed away. You say they died. And because that's what it is. And I just said, brace yourselves, George is dead. And they both reacted. My dad said, oh no. And my mom, she said, just keep talking,
John.
And so I just told her everything and just talked her through it.
That was 45 years ago for John, and you can still feel it. The kind of grief that doesn't disappear. It just learns how to live alongside you. And I think there's something more important about hearing the truth of what people have lived through. Not the softened version, not the version that's easier to say out loud, but what actually happened. Because it's in those moments, the real ones, that we too start to realize we're not the only ones carrying something heavy. That we're not as alone as it can sometimes feel. In listening to John, I couldn't help but think about those moments in life that stay with you forever. The phone calls, the conversations, the seconds that change everything. And then, life keeps going. John and his parents moved forward, learning how to live with a kind of grief that doesn't quite make sense. That isn't something you ever expected or fully know how to hold. And over time, life begins to take shape again. John's career continues as a journalist, as an editor at CNN. There's a wife, children, and a life that from the outside looks like it's moving forward. Until 2011, when his world is turned upside down. And this time, it wasn't going to be the grief of losing a sibling. We'll be right back. Today's Change Happen story is sponsored by Pure Energy Apothecary. Owner Don Lancaster and I are friends, and honestly, that matters. It's how I know how much care goes into what she makes. Dawn doesn't create products just to sell them. She makes them because she uses them and cares about how they support real people like you. Her magnesium butter has become a staple in my daily life when my muscles feel tired, when my legs won't settle at night, or when my nervous system feels like it's been running on overdrive, which, let's be honest, a lot of us can relate to. Magnesium supports muscle relaxation, helps with sleep, and eases that wired but tired feeling. This butter is creamy and absorbs right into the skin. No heaviness, no overpowering scent, just comfort. For me, it's not just relief. It's a small ritual that tells my body it's safe to slow down. If you're craving that kind of support, visit pureenergyvt.com and use code PURECHANGE to get your 20% off. Now back to John's story.
By this time, both of the older kids were grown and away from home. My wife was working in Philadelphia, and Stephen and I were living together in D.C., and then I would go up to visit Cindy in Philly on weekends. It was about an hour and a half drive. Stephen was working as a cook. I was working at CNN, and so we were sort of like ships passing in the night, but we kept in touch. And, I could tell there were issues. There were times when I would talk to him and he was almost incoherent. I just racked it up to him working double shifts and being really tired and all that kind of stuff. He was running through money a lot. His bank account was pretty depleted. He'd get paid and, the money was gone way before the next paycheck came. So, we were struggling to try to help him use money more responsibly. He'd say, well, one of my friends, needed some dough. And so he, when your kid is telling you he's being generous to a friend, that's a good thing, right? So I knew something was wrong when I went to Philly, and about 6 a.m, I got a phone call from him, and he was very concerned because his left arm was numb. Call the advice nurse for our HMO and let me know what they say. And he called me back and they said, they need me to come in now. So I drove back from Philly to DC, and I get to the hospital, and one of the nurses took me aside and said, we are very concerned about your son, but we can't tell you why.
John's son is 22 at the time this is happening, an adult in the eyes of the medical field. And to me, this is one of those moments that feels hard to make sense of. Because suddenly your child is over the age of 18. Doctors can no longer share information with the parents without consent from their suddenly adult child.
So I go into him and I say, dude, I can't help you if you don't tell me. And he said, well, I think, the dope I smoked was laced with something. When he's about to be discharged, he lets me come into the room with him and the doctor. And he hands me his discharge sheet. And it says, among other things, stop using heroin. And I go, what the fuck, dude? And so that's how I found out.
John is a remarkable human, full of compassion. Instead of reacting out of anger in that moment, he stayed calm. He told his son they needed to talk, but they were both exhausted. So they went home, took a nap, and later that day woke up and had a heart-to-heart.
And he was open with me. He said that, he started using heroin and had only done it about 3 times, he said. And I said, well, I don't know a lot about heroin, but what I do know is if you do it once, you're addicted because you're always chasing that first wonderful high. And he said, yeah, I've heard that too, but, I'm able to manage it, and I've only done it a couple of times. And in my mind, the depression was the underlying root cause. And so he agreed that he would try to get psychological help to deal with that. And he did. He tried. The guy's schedule was full. They said, call back in 2 weeks. A week later, I had to borrow my car. And I said, when are you going to be back? He said, about 11 o'clock, because I've got a double shift tomorrow morning. The next morning, I'm up at like 5 going down to Journal. He's not home yet. The routine that we had is I'd leave the light on, on the table. When he gets home, you turn out the light and go to bed. Well, the light was still on and he wasn't in his room. I heard his alarm go off and, all that. Nothing. He's not there. So I start calling him and nothing. I'm not getting through. So when the time came for him to be at work and I still wasn't hearing from him, I called work to make sure he was there. And they said, he's not here either. We've been trying to call him too. And that's when I called the cops.
And this is where John's story becomes even more difficult. Just weeks earlier, he learns his son was struggling with heroin addiction. And now he's missing. But not only is he missing, he's an adult. It's a Saturday, and they're living in Washington, D.C. To them, he just didn't come home. And the police are saying,
we will call you on Monday.
But as a parent, when you know, you know. In that moment, that knowing doesn't carry any weight in the eyes of law enforcement. So, John did what any parent would do. He started searching, calling people, following leads, trying to piece together his son's last known movements, trying to find him before it was too late.
He was missing for a week. He wasn't using his phone. He wasn't making withdrawals from the bank. His car wasn't found anywhere. We just didn't know. One of the women that he used to shoot up with took me to all their places where they would get drugs, and we launched a search party. We brought people together to try to look for him. And while we had launched this major search, we got a phone call from the police. They wanted us, to meet us at home.
And then the call comes. They ask them to meet at their house. And this is where John finds himself in his parents' shoes, but this time on the receiving end. The detectives tell them,
"We found the car, and there's a body in it."
At that moment, John slips into what he knows best, asking questions.
Did you find drug paraphernalia?
Yes.
I want to see it. I want to go there.
We can tell you where it is, but there is crime scene tape up, and you won't be able to get close.
But it was just a block and a half away from our house, parked just down the street.
John said when he arrived, it was pouring rain outside, crime scene tape everywhere. And I don't know if there's anything that prepares you for that moment. When the story stops being something that you're hearing and becomes something that you're standing inside. John is told he needs to go to the coroner's office to identify his son there.
And when I got to the morgue, there was a representative from the Went Center for Loss and Healing, and they handed me a brochure and then backed off. And so I brought the brochure home, put it on the dining room table. Cindy and I would read it from time to time. And at one point, Cindy said, "We need to do this."
John and his wife Cindy enter grief counseling. They thought it was going to be together, but what surprised him most was that they were asked to do it separately, to process as individuals.
And they were right, because everybody has their own stuff. And so Cindy and I both went to the Went Center, met with separate counselors, and that was wonderful because you really can talk in a safe environment with someone who is trained to guide the conversation. And I think probably one of the biggest takeaways for me is that everybody grieves differently. And during this time, Cindy and I were together. She moved back to DC, and we were in the car, and a CD came on, a song came on, and she hit the button to advance it to the next track. And I remember asking her, "How come you did that?" And she said, "Every time I hear that song, it makes me cry." The interesting thing was, every time I heard the song, I would hit repeat because it made me cry. Same song, same emotional reaction, different way of dealing with it. And that's when I realized that there's no one way to grieve. And I also realized that there was no way that I was going to be able to fix Cindy, and that comparing our grief to one another was going to doom the marriage.
And this becomes a turning point, because what they begin to understand is that grief doesn't look the same for everyone, even between two people who love the same person. And even in all of this, there's something in John that didn't shut down, something that kept looking for meaning, for understanding, a way forward. John and Cindy had been married for 47 years at the time we recorded this, and it's this understanding, this space they gave each other, that allowed them to not just survive this loss, but to stay connected through it. John didn't turn to counseling after losing his sister. He turned to writing, fiction, something he now teaches. But after losing his son, he chose to face his grief, to move through it instead of letting it define him. John told me that one of the things that gives him hope today is meeting people in recovery, people who are finding their way forward. Even though that wasn't his son's path, he holds hope and space for others. So I asked John, what are you doing with all of this today?
Where I am now is probably, I'm in the zone. I'm probably more fully integrated as me than ever before. I'm doing what I'm good at and what I love, and that makes life meaningful. In fact, that's probably the sixth stage of grief, is finding meaning. As I mentioned earlier, I started writing fiction 15 years after my sister died, and 40 years after that car train collision that I witnessed. And it was during that time, after the third novel came out, that my son died. And so in all six of my novels, my protagonist is dealing with different kinds of grief situations, because, you take what you know and you pour it into the story that you're creating and the character you've created. So I look back now on the 20 years worth of books in print, and I realized that's what I've been doing. I've been processing my grief through my stories. And I've gotten to a point where a lot of the teaching that I do, the writing teaching that I do, is facing your writing fears and using writing as a way to heal from grief.
John's an incredible writer. I've read his books, and every one of them pulls you in, makes you feel like you're a part of something. And even though it's fiction, you're seeing pieces of his world in all of it. And that's the beauty of it. He gets to tell the truth in a way that's his. And having a conversation with someone who has spent a lifetime telling stories, I realized something important. We were both doing the same thing, just in different ways, telling stories to heal our grief. So, as we wrapped up our conversation, I asked John, what makes you smile today?
Oh, well, Cindy, my wife, we've been together, it'll be 48 years in July. And, we've got a good rapport. She's an amazing person. She's very smart, smarter than I am. And she's funny. She's got a great sense of humor. She's a generous person. She makes me smile.
His answer didn't surprise me. After 47 years, and they still make each other smile, that's something special. So, I asked him to leave you with one piece of wisdom.
Breathe. Just breathe. And be aware that, you need to be in the moment, because we spend all our time regretting the past or fearing the future. And neither of those things we can change. We can't change the past, and the future's not here yet. So the only control we've got is over the moment.
This seems to be something I hear again and again on this show. You don't realize how short life is until it's gone. And I believe life is measured in breaths. So take each one as if it matters, because it does. For someone who spent his life telling the truth, this might be one of the most honest stories of them all. John's story is one of resilience, understanding, and hope. And just knowing there are people like him in the world, this gives me hope. And it's my hope that it does the same for you too. There'll be links to all of John's books and resources in the show notes, as well as at changehappenedpodcast.com. If you haven't read one of his books yet, go ahead. You won't regret it. And now for the What Changed Me community drawing information. Head to changehappenedpodcast.com. Click on the What Changed Me banner to tell us what stayed with you from today's episode or any interview episode you listen to as part of the What Changed Me community drawing. Each time you share, you'll be entered into a Change Happened drawing. You can enter more than once. Every entry is also automatically included into our quarterly drawing for a special Change Happened Super Prize, whether you've won before or not. Change doesn't end the story. It's often where the next chapter begins. If something in today's episode stayed with you, a moment, a sentence, a feeling, I'd love to hear about it. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, consider sharing this episode with them. Because these stories don't end where the episode does. They keep moving forward in what we carry with us and in who we pass them on to. Change Happened, Then What is written, edited, and produced by me, Heather Holt, with the loyal background support from my two sidekicks, Waylon and Dalton. Until next time, keep smiling and maybe let your dog inspire your next big idea.